So without further ado, let me pass it on to Deb and we'll get the webinar rolling.
Thank you so much, Brian. And again, once more, a big welcome to everybody for joining us today. I know this Lunch and Learn is time that you guys have carved out, and we're hoping to leave you with quite a bit of useful information. And let me begin by introducing our presenter, Chris Capps. He is the Chief Information Security Officer here at Sequentur. He has a wealth of cybersecurity experience. He's been with Sequentur quite a long time, and his focus is 100% on cybersecurity and compliance services. I do like to say that we eat our own cake because Sequentur is SOC 2 Type 2 certified. So we take security internally, not just for ourselves, but we go to great lengths to make sure that all of our clients are safe and secure. And we're doing everything that we possibly can to ensure that does happen, because we know there's a lot of bad actors and nastiness that happens out in the world. Chris has, as I mentioned, is well versed in cybersecurity. He has a master's degree in cybersecurity as well as digital forensics, and currently in process of getting his PhD. Will be leading the webinar, and joining him today is Gabe Leszlauer. He is our Director of Quality Control. He's been with Sequentur a number of years. He focuses primarily on infrastructure, cloud migrations, and pretty much has handled nearly everything across a on-prem, hybrid, and all cloud server environment. So Gabe will be chiming in from time to time with tips and tricks regarding how to make things better for you all and things that he's faced. As far as our agenda, as you can see in front of you, we're going to be talking about what you need to do from a pre-migration perspective, things that you want to take into consideration, how you properly prepare in advance of a migration or a shift to Azure AD, what that process may look like, as well as post-migration cleanup steps. And of course, that will affect and require some changes within your internal processes. And then towards the end, we'll be talking about pros and cons. You know, it's a big decision to do a migration project, and most importantly, the lessons learned. We do want to share with you some of the common pitfalls that our engineering teams come across and help you avoid those, so that when you do the migration, it will go as smooth and seamlessly as possible. So does anybody have any questions about our agenda? No. Okay. Well, with that said, some of you I've met personally, and I want to welcome you again to Sequentur. For those of you who are not familiar with Sequentur, I'm going to give you a unabashed blurb on us. Obviously, we're cloud migration specialists, but in addition to that, we do all things Microsoft. We're a gold partner, and as you probably gleaned already, we focus primarily on cybersecurity, compliance, and then the other side of our house is IT management, and that includes business continuity, disaster recovery. We also offer 24/7 monitoring with full help desk services. So I like to say that we're the friendly company. We work as much or as little with our clients as they want and need, but this is just a snippet of the breadth of our services. So if anybody has any questions or would like to have a more in-depth conversation about who we are and what we do and how we might be able to add value to you, would love to have that conversation. So any questions about Sequentur or what we're going to be doing today? No? Okay. Well, let me hand the presentation baton to Chris, and he'll get started. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Deb. Welcome, everybody. Appreciate you joining us today. Definitely want this to be interactive. So if you have any burning questions that you want to get out there, please do so, whether that's through a chat or through your microphone. We're happy to have you. Additionally, we're going to go ahead and put up a poll just to kind of get you all moving. This poll is going to be kind of what your current status is as far as migration into Azure Active Directory from on-prem. Maybe you've thought about it. Maybe you've tried to move and ran into some roadblocks. We'll go ahead and throw that poll up there so you can give us some response. Give it just a minute, and then we'll go ahead and talk about what you need to do prior to conducting a migration. All right, looks like we've got some good coverage in there. 33% in the planning phase, 50% actively migrating, and 16% fully migrated. So got a nice spread going on there. Hopefully, those of you that have taken part in this activity can help share some of the experience and the insights with your colleagues during this webinar. So to begin, Active Directory to Azure AD, pre-migration assessment. So I think we're all relatively familiar with Active Directory, Azure AD, and the difference. But for those of you that may not be, Active Directory is your on-premise source for managing identities, and then Azure AD is a cloud-based source for managing identities. Functionally, they operate in the same way. There are some nuances between the two, but very much, if you're familiar with one, you can work in the other. Now, when you're talking about a pre-migration assessment, so it's important for a variety of reasons. You definitely need a good picture of what your current Active Directory environment looks like. You need to consider what systems your Active Directory currently integrates with, which of those systems and applications may be configured for single sign-on. The items that are configured for single sign-on, if not addressed properly once you move, your users may lose authentication capabilities. Do I have any systems that absolutely will not migrate to the cloud? Usually, these are legacy systems or systems designed specifically for one purpose that do not generally have cloud support. Sometimes it can be a showstopper. Sometimes there's workarounds. It really depends on the item that decides to be the problem child. Do I have backdoor access to everything in case something goes awry? So prior to making any moves, you want to make sure that you have the ability to authenticate into your critical systems despite what's going on with the migration. So in the event that Active Directory authentication gets broken, you want to have a backdoor domain admin account. And in the event that authentication to 365 gets broken, you want to have a backdoor admin account to 365, etc. You want to consider, do you have the proper licensing in 365, right? So if you're looking at a fresh move, definitely want to start as clean as possible. Most of you already have some kind of presence in 365, but prior to making that move, it's good to audit your licensing to ensure the functionality and the security features that you need are going to be there in the environment. This is also going to allow you to configure those items as you need them. And then decide for yourself, will you be using Intune to manage your machines after the fact? Microsoft has made quite a bit of investment to ensure that organizations can manage their machines in Intune, much in the same way that we have done historically with Active Directory, so much so that they have begun implementing essentially the entire Windows settings template inside of Intune for your perusal and implementation. And also you have the ability to analyze your current existing group policies inside of Intune to determine what feature sets are transferable, what may not be, and a plan to address those. Excuse me one second. All right. And please feel free to stop me if you have questions. So Active Directory to Azure AD considerations. So is this feasible for my environment? The biggest question here is going to be that legacy point from the previous slide. If you have a bunch of systems, applications, functionality that do not support a cloud existence, it may not be feasible for you to migrate to Azure Active Directory. You still may be able to operate in some form of hybrid environment, but to go completely to the cloud, if your critical applications and systems aren't going to support it, it's not going to make sense from a business perspective. Then you need to consider what your existing integrations are. Make sure you transfer those over to Azure Active Directory as needed. Specifically, I'm thinking single sign-on applications, any kind of critical business unit system that you may have. So if you have a customer relation database, if you have a QuickBooks database, etc., you want to make sure that that integration, those authentication mechanisms are still going to play well once you're moved. And then you need to consider what needs to be handled now versus after the migration. And what I mean by this is there are certain things that you are absolutely going to want in place prior to the migration, namely your security controls from an authentication perspective, any kind of file sharing, groups, permissions, etc. There are going to be things that you can handle after a migration. So these are going to be advanced configurations, fine-tuning of the teams, fine-tuning of the groups. You will even get into a situation where you're going to continue the development of your environment after the migration. So there will technically always be things to be handled after the migration. And then potential roadblocks. So the biggest roadblock is kind of the first thing I mentioned with the legacy applications. The other items for you is cost effectiveness. So if you have a well-built, robust system and your expenditures are making sense for you, the addition of a subscription cost might not make sense, right? So it's definitely a financial consideration as well as a functionality consideration. So in order to prepare for the migration, so we've done the pre-assessment, we've decided we want to move forward, we don't have any showstoppers in our way. What do we need to do to prepare to move? So the first thing to do is to ensure that your cloud environment is configured to your desired ending state. And what I mean by that is, you know, your security configurations are on, your groups are built out so you know where to put people. Your data retention mechanisms are configured. These items are going to be easier to implement when it's a fresh environment as opposed to going back and implementing them after the fact. You need to prepare the on-premise environment to desynchronize the objects. There's a couple of ways you can go about this from a technical perspective, but basically we want to keep the new environment as clean as possible. So synchronization needs to be set up in such a way that we're only getting the objects that we need into Azure Active Directory. Once that's done, we really want to start having the conversations with the support teams for any organizations involved so that they understand the coming change and what to expect. Potentially using the support team as a pilot group in order to be able to give them that hands-on knowledge of the new environment, new functionality, etc. Once the support team is prepared, you want to prepare the users. So much in the same way you're going to prepare the support team, you want to focus on what's going to change for the users, give them an open line of communication to the support team, and just allow them to provide feedback to you freely in the event that something goes wrong. Once the people are ready, once the plan is ready, once the environment is ready, we need to prepare the items that need to be handled prior to the migration so that they function once the users have been migrated. So I'm going to lean back on the QuickBooks example. Generally speaking, accounting teams are very sensitive to downtime, finance teams too. And so during this migration, we want to make sure that when they're migrated, that critical access is already going to be situated. We do so by generating a test account in any case that it's possible, or testing with the users under a piloting circumstance to ensure that that mechanism is going to work once the migration has been complete. All right, I think we've got another poll we're going to throw up there. While Brian gets that situated, we're going to talk about the process next. Anybody have any questions?
I just want to add these next two polls are multiple selection. So if more than one answer is appropriate, you could select as many as you'd like on these next couple polls.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. Give it just another moment. All right, we got a question come in. Will you be able to provide guidance on which built-in reports are most beneficial to preparing for a migration? When you say built-in reports, are you talking about object status, domain settings, domain configuration, etc.? Yeah, absolutely. So that's part of the prep for it, is identifying what's critical, what's functional, what's, what might exist, but it doesn't need to exist, et cetera. That's part of the discovery process of the migration. Absolutely. Good question. All right. So we've got a good spread of responses here. It looks like it's split tie between security implications, user training and adoption, and the cost of migration, and data loss risk comes in a close second. So absolutely, those are all considerations to be made when undertaking any IT project, which is why we brought this poll up. We want to help address some of those concerns. So if you have any specific questions regarding your organization, please feel free to reach out to us after the webinar is completed. Looks like we might be waiting for one more question, so I'll just hold off for 1 second. All right. We can pick it up. Oh, actually, if some of these guides would be provided today. Understood. Yeah, so I don't think that we have any guides to provide you today. I'll defer to Brian and Deb on that one. I will say that it's very difficult to give a guide for any given environment because every environment is so different. All right, so for the process to moving Active Directory to Azure AD. So once the environment has been prepped, it is time to ensure the process is valid with a test user and begin migration. You can do this in a variety of ways. You can use your piloting group and just be sure that they're aware that they're being tested with. You can also generate a test user. The key there, though, is make sure that you are building that user in the same manner and process that you use during any normal new hire process. That way, all of the attributes, configurations, groups, etc., are all the same. Depending on the method and level of integration, the process can be done all at once or on a per user basis. So if you are a very small organization, you absolutely can stage everything, pull the trigger, and move. If you are a larger organization, just for safety's sake, we're always going to recommend, doing it with a pilot stage approach in the sense that you're running a small group of tech-friendly / tech-savvy users for the initial process. You run with phase 1 of users and then follow up with whatever number of phases you need following that. So a lot of this experience is based off of our own migration. And Sequentur has been around a few years and had a few different system integrations. And because we had so many moving parts to consider, including the existence of Okta at the time, we found it best to handle each user individually. We did this for a number of reasons. In order to avoid crossed objects with Intune, we did it to avoid mismatching objects with 365 in general. We also did it to ensure that Okta did not cause any problems with authentication while we were moving to the cloud. And if anything were to happen, the impact would be minimal because we were handling one person as opposed to the group. We have that benefit because we are an IT firm. So the ability to do one at a time, the decision was not difficult. However, for your organization, we understand that that might not make sense, which is why we recommend the pilot stage approach. The average time per user for migration. So one good thing out of doing each individual user by hand, we found the average time per user for migration was around 40 minutes. However, most of that was spent waiting on Microsoft's processes to catch up with the changes, right? So once you make a change in Microsoft, it takes however long they decide it takes to propagate that change throughout all the systems. And then given proper instructions, this very well could be accomplished during after hours time. And what I mean by that is if the users are prepared properly and they know what to expect and they're familiar with general login process, the migration, the change for all of those is minimal after the migration. So users still should be able to function, still should be able to accomplish their daily activities. So once you're done with any big project, and Active Directory to Azure AD is no different, you want to make sure you clean up the old environment and anything that you had to create to test or stage the new environment. So you want to make sure you defederate your domain. So once the appropriate objects have been migrated, the defederation severs the connection between Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. So if you're in a hybrid situation, this will allow full control over the federated domain objects from the cloud portal. What this does, this allows you to completely dictate your object attributes, so your user attributes. If you do not defederate the domain once you've migrated, you will not be able to directly configure anything with that federated domain. So it's really a restriction on functionality if you do not. Once that has been complete, you want to make sure that all of the on-premise servers have been decommissioned. Back up the servers in case for whatever emergency you need to pull the information or stand the environment back up. Keep those for the set period of time that is determined by your organization's retention policies, and then shut off the servers and live solely in the cloud at that point. The biggest thing that I've seen from an on-prem environment once the migration is done is you don't want to leave any of those servers, any of the infrastructure connected in any way, because it becomes a forgotten attack surface area if you just ignore it. So definitely want to make sure that you clean up after yourself. So process changes a little bit. Once migrated, the processes once associated with Active Directory will need to be involved. User management becomes quite easy once everything is in the cloud inside of Entra and Azure AD. So for those of you that aren't familiar, they recently renamed Azure AD to Entra. It's the same thing. They've restructured it a little bit. They've moved the menus around as Microsoft likes to do. But it definitely, everything is right there. Everything is in the cloud. You don't have to worry about the multiple moving pieces. The onboarding and offboarding process becomes far more streamlined because you don't have to worry about cross systems. You don't have to worry about making sure that, you know, the account is disabled here, the account is disabled there, did the sync take, et cetera, et cetera. Additionally, the SSO configurations that you once had in Azure and in Active Directory now take place in Azure, and all of those access requests are protected by the access policies that you have in place, whether that's the security defaults in 365 tenants or the conditional access policies associated with Azure conditional access. All right, Brian's going to go ahead and put up our last slide of the presentation. We're going to give that just a minute. Does anybody have any questions up to this point? In this poll, after migrating to Azure AD, what will be your primary focus? Enhancing security, improving user experience, streamlining IT process, or monitoring and compliance? Give it just another moment. All right. It looks like the winner is monitoring and compliance. So monitoring and compliance followed by enhancing security and streamlining processes, and then improving user experience. Thank you all for those responses. All right, let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons associated with completing the move to Azure Active Directory from Active Directory. So for me, the pros outweigh the cons. You have better control of your accounts. What I mean by that is you have identity and risk controls. You also have your access controls, data prevention controls, etc. You have less attack surface area simply by having less systems. Additionally, Active Directory servers are among the most attacked infrastructure pieces, in the business environment. You get the benefit of the full breadth of Microsoft security features. So Microsoft calls this Defender these days. Defender is an umbrella. There's, I don't know, 12, 15 different products that sit under the Defender umbrella that you can take advantage of inside of the environment. And you have no more on-premise infrastructure. So you don't have to worry about the server refreshes. You don't have to worry about the maintenance. You don't have to worry about the liability of that attack surface area. And I know you all can probably think of a couple more pros and cons for each of these. The cons for me really is that there's no on-premise infrastructure, and the only real event that's a con is if you have a legacy environment that requires you maintain the on-premise infrastructure. I suppose you could add something like the recurring cost associated with 365 and Azure subscriptions, but I would argue that if you balance that against the costs associated with server maintenance and the liability with maintaining that attack surface area, it definitely makes sense to transfer at least the back-end liability to a company like Microsoft. So I wouldn't say that. So the question came in: con is loss of group policy. I don't know that I would agree with that much, in the sense that Microsoft is making a concerted effort to put everything that exists within Active Directory into Azure Active Directory Entra. The group policy settings, you have the ability to analyze the group policies and implement those features in Intune. It's not going to be a direct, let me just pull out the JSON file for the group policies and import them. But they absolutely do facilitate that control, inside of the Intune management. But also, some of that group policy is more general organization leading, and you can use it to facilitate that as well. Comment from Sean: Intune is some of the items, but not as robust as of yet. Yeah, so that's a great point. Over the last few years, they have, like as I mentioned, made tremendous effort to build that out to be a replacement for the current Active Directory. We are of the mindset that here shortly, on-premise Active Directory will be a thing of the past, and pretty much everybody will be operating inside of the cloud in one way or another. All great questions. I'm going to pause just for a second. So have you seen success with third-party group policy applications as Policy Pack? Cedric, to be honest with you, I've never used Policy Pack. We don't generally use third-party group policy applications simply because we can replicate anything that we need to in the systems that we have. Happy to talk about that offline though. For the lessons learned for Active Directory to Azure AD. So SSO is a big one, especially if you have the critical line of business applications like QuickBooks or any of your CRMs or any kind of one-off legacy software that you might have. If you have any authentication mechanisms that are running through Active Directory, maybe it's not SSO, maybe you're using LDAPs. You want to make sure that you've evaluated that functionality and what that's going to look like once the migration has been completed. For auto provisioning, so once you get moved over, a lot of the applications that you're using nowadays have the ability to do auto provisioning inside of the environment. Essentially what this means is as you onboard a user, you apply them a group, that group, let's say, is the accounting group and gets QuickBooks. That QuickBooks application is auto provisioned. They can log in with single sign-on. And then the service account. So this is probably the most tedious of evaluations, especially in larger environments, because you have, service accounts that have existed forever. If any of your Active Directory accounts were used as service accounts in other systems, I definitely want to evaluate the functionality. If they're able to exist inside of the cloud and potentially put in compensating controls, it's best to move them to the new environment. That may potentially be a showstopper in the sense that you might not have, in the context of the legacy systems discussed previously, you might not actually have a legacy system, but the system uses an authentication mechanism or an account that doesn't play well with the cloud. That will need to be addressed during planning. All right, any questions for me? We've reached the end of the slides. Definitely didn't want to kill you with slides, but happy to answer any questions, and I'll go ahead and pass it over to Deb.
Thanks so much, Chris. So with that said, I'm actually going to reach out and ask Gabe to talk a little bit. Chris mentioned some of the common pitfalls and obstacles we run into. Gabe has a lot of experience, and perhaps he can share with the group here, a couple things that he's bumped into in terms of what we typically see. We've helped a number of different organizations across truly all verticals, nonprofits, associations, financial, healthcare, the whole works. Cedric, yeah, you have a question, please chime in.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say that Chris and Gabe migrated my entire environment. And so we moved to Office 365 and authentication in 2 steps. And if in your evaluation process you decide that you go to hybrid environment, I'd probably recommend against it and go straight to Azure AD, just based on my experience. And ironically, we had the exact same situation with QuickBooks. And we had a legacy application. And for those of you who are running Financial Edge, we had it on premise. We virtualized it. We used Citrix to get it out to the client users. And then a new person came in and decided it was better to just go to QuickBooks. So sometimes some internal self-evaluation about what applications you want to keep, whether it's worth converting the legacy application to something that can work in the cloud or not. You may just want to go to something that's cloud-based at the beginning and save yourself a lot of trouble. But yeah, another thing I would also is recommend to audit your users. We had a lot of shared mailboxes that we migrated some accounts, and so sometimes looking through those afterwards and asking yourself, is that really still an account that needs to be kept, or can we delete it? And but the only other hiccup I'd say is that when you do user management in Azure AD, that when you retire an account for an employee who's left the association, their mailbox and their OneDrive only has limited lifespan. So you should have a means of retaining the data in their OneDrive within the time frame before Microsoft deletes it. So we went with a third-party backup solution. We're using Veeam in addition to the standard Microsoft backup.
Well, those are all excellent points and good ideas for people to keep in mind. So does anybody else on the call have anything they'd like to share, or maybe a specific question regarding your environment? I know we've got folks that are all on-prem, they're hybrid, and some people have actually made the full migration to the cloud. So would love your comments and questions. Okay, Gabe, maybe you want to chime in. This would be a good point where you can share, in addition to what Cedric mentioned, anything else that you might have bumped into that was helpful, whether it be preparation or the migration itself.
Sure. Thank you, Deb.
Mhm.
Welcome, everyone. So we've been doing this for several years, and we moved a lot of companies to cloud only in the recent years. A good point that Cedric mentioned is data retention in the 365 tenant. So compared to your local environment, once you move users to the cloud, basically when you start offboarding users, you have a limited time on that data retention. So once you have a full setup in Microsoft Azure, there are several reasons to implement a business continuity plan regarding your data, because everything is going to reside in the cloud infrastructure, and Microsoft has limited retention policy on everything. Surely you can enable litigation holds on certain objects, but that's not a backup solution. We usually use Veeam for 365, which is going to back up your entire 365 environment, including SharePoint, OneDrive, and your mailboxes. In certain cases, you can also back up your Teams channels and most of the data in Teams. This is highly recommended. You can control your own retention, and it is a very, very small cost compared to what you may face if you lose your data. Another cost effectiveness related comment is you have to evaluate your on-premises environment, because with this move, depending on your infrastructure, you may need to move your SQL services, for example, to Microsoft Azure and integrate with everything that you have there with the user migrations. Performance is going to be all cost dependent. What I mean by that is that you have to pay for everything in the cloud, and you are used to a certain performance on premises, which may not translate to the same performance when you move to the cloud. And if you want to achieve the same performance, let's say in a SQL server, then you will have to pay extra for that. So these are very important steps to actually take into consideration. Also, the migration process, just like we mentioned it in the very beginning with the legacy applications, will highlight your other weak spots on the infrastructure that you have on premises. So no matter what happens, it's very important to actually have a very deep dive and assess what you have to move and what you will have remaining, and if those services and devices that you have remaining on premises can integrate with Azure AD. On top of this, probably one of the most difficult things is to manage the users. I mean, not from an administration point of view, but once you make a big change like this, you start managing your employees or users instead of the infrastructure, because that change may also raise a couple of questions, like users are just not used to these new things. Like there are other people who can't really easily adopt to these cloud environments, and they just simply don't know what's going on. So that's also something that internal training can be a difference between ice and fire, literally. Always have a fallback plan. So when we do migrations, even though we do staging and we try everything to our best knowledge to make it as smooth as possible, there are systems that unfortunately you may or may not be able to test. And if those systems will fail for whatever reason when you fail over to the cloud, you should have a plan to fall back. So planning is a huge factor in this, and that's basically your way to success. Always go with small groups, like Chris mentioned before. We had probably one client who pushed us to ignore everything a couple of years ago, and we had to do a migration which included Intune, and they had a hybrid environment. Against our recommendations, they wanted to push through everything over one day when we did the failover, and we had to migrate like 300 or 400 users at the same time. And against our recommendations, they were just pushing the limits, and we had to basically fall back because they were just simply not listening. And that postponed the entire process for roughly a month, because they had to plan everything out what we originally proposed. And yeah, it's just going to be painful for everyone. Also, regarding the defederation, so when you disconnect these services, you also have to take it into consideration that depending on the size of the tenant and the data that you migrated, once you disconnect the service, it may take up to 3 days to actually manage the objects in the 365 tenants. And what I mean by this, you may or may not be able to change a password in 365 because the defederation process and the cloud conversion is just taking place in the tenant, and there is no way for you to actually make any changes. And this is like something that I like to highlight, because you probably, whatever you do, you probably want to do this over a weekend, or maybe a holiday, when if you have to take any new steps in the tenant, like change a password or add a user or change a group or some kind of policy, you should be prepared for this change. Probably these are the most common things that we run into.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gabe, for adding that in. And it looks like there were a couple comments in the chat that some other folks might have encountered, such as starting with new. Go ahead.
Do you use any specific tools to move the user profiles on the computers to a new Azure AD account, or did you just start with brand new profiles? So it really depends. It really depends on from what environment you move to, let's say, Microsoft Intune controlled devices. In some cases, and hopefully that's not the case in your environment, like users tend to save data in their user profiles, like on the desktop, and there was no control before how to manage that, and maybe you didn't have the 365 environment, or OneDrive was not set to actually back everything up to the cloud and synchronize across your accounts. In these cases, probably it's a really good idea to actually do user profile migrations once you have the cloud user set. But like I mentioned, it can be yes or no, depending on the environment. Hopefully, before you do something like this, you already have a OneDrive profile across the user's devices, so that you don't have to do a profile migration. But in some cases, it may be required. Like every organization is different.
Excellent point. Well, good. Well, I know we're bumping up to the time. We're slightly over 2 minutes. So I'd like to respect everybody's time, and also thank you again for attending. And as a thank you for carving time out of your day, Sequentur, we would be very happy to provide a complimentary 1-hour assessment of your environment. So if you would like to get engaged with us, certainly feel free to reach out to me or Chris or Gabe. We are available to you. And again, thank you very much for attending. And should you have a question afterwards, you see our emails, our phone numbers. We're very flexible and available to you. So again, everyone, thank you so much for attending. I hope this was useful, and we'll look forward to chatting again soon.
Deb, Marcus wants to know if we will be at DISC 2025.
I will defer to Brian, but I believe we are. I don't want to speak out of turn.
Yeah, we plan on attending, Marcus, so I will follow up with you separately on that.
Excellent. Looking forward to having you guys there.
Awesome.
Thank you.
To follow up with that, thank you again, everyone, for taking some time out of your busy schedule. And as a reminder, this is being recorded, and we'll get Sean the link to share with everyone tomorrow.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.